Good afternoon. I'm sure many of you have already received the devastating news from our government economists that the GDP of the Philippines declined by minus 16.5% in the second quarter. And I was a little amused because just before the announcement, I was looking at the range of forecasts of dozens of economists, both foreign and local, and they range from minus 2.3 decline to minus 23% decline. My point is, in the next 12 to 18 months, we will be getting forecasts which will be equally devastating, because until we're able to lick this pandemic, and there will be second, third, fourth waves, we don't know, a lot is uncertain. I consider short-term forecasts really irrelevant. Number one, because they are results of guesstimates. And number two, because they do not reflect the fundamentals of the Philippine economy, as was already mentioned by our chairman. And that is why what I would like to do is take a long-term view of the Philippine economy as reflected in a good number of assessments made by independent think tanks and institutions outside of the Philippines. Though these are not self-serving propaganda from our government or even from so-called prophet of boom like me. These are completely independent opinions about why the Philippines is considered one of the most attractive emerging markets, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but in the world, over a 10-year period. Let's take a look first at what a virus, no matter how virulent, will take away from us. Please, the first slide. Next. We are very fortunate. In fact, to quote from the prayer, we are in the right place at the right time. And this is something fixed. It is a geographic advantage that we have. We are right in the epicenter of what will be the most dynamic economic region in the whole world in the next 10 to 20 years. It's called Asia Pacific by a lot, but now I see more and more people calling it Indo-Pacific, because we have to include India. India, despite all the political chaos that they have there, is, in fact, in one of the slides I will show you, considered to be the most promising emerging market in the next 10 years, surpassing China. As you can see in the slide, the whole world has graduated from the American century of the 20th century, where there were three competing economic territories, the US, Japan, and EU, to the Asian century, where there are also three competing territories, China, India, and the ASEAN Economic Community, made up of 10 countries to which we belong. And you take a look at the lower figures, before the pandemic, countries from the American century were struggling to grow at anywhere from 0.6% to 2.9%. And there's no reason why they can surpass those figures once the pandemic is over. They will stay at those rates and even lower. While if you take a look at the countries of the so-called Asian century, figures of 6.6, 7.1, 5.2, almost 2 to 3 times the growth rates of the countries of the American century. And this is where we will return after the pandemic. And so our first long-term objective, and I'm very sure that the majority of those who are listening to me are expecting to live at least for the next 10 years, not like some of us who are already way above 70, I'm sure many of you are in your 50s and your 60s. You have at least the next 20 years to look forward to. And that is why it is reasonable that you should look long term and not be depressed by what we will be seeing in the next 12 to 18 months until the vaccine is not only discovered, but is widely distributed all over the world. I repeat, we should not really pay too much attention to macroeconomic figures, GDP, and so on and so forth over the next 12 to 18 months so that we don't lose our entrepreneurial spirit, which has to always be a long-term view. Next, please. Now, if you will remember, more than 15 years ago, so this is also a long-term view that was taken by an economist from Goldman Sachs, by the name of Jim O'Neill. He coined BRIC. I'm sure many of you still remember that acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China. Unfortunately, over the last 10 years, Brazil and Russia fell along the way. They mismanaged their economies. And so you really have only India and China left from the original BRIC, but the ASEAN has been added. And the figures here show clearly why the ASEAN now belongs to the same league as China and India. Large populations, very manageable macroeconomic figures. And so here is again another advantage of the Philippines. We belong to this magic circle within the Indo-Pacific region. Next, please. The same economist added 11 other countries that were considered emerging engines of growth over the next 20 years. And if you will note, again, this is an outside economist, there are only 3 ASEAN countries included in this honor roll, so to speak, of emerging markets. And they are Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. In fact, some of you might have heard me before coining the initials VIP, not very important person, but Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines as the 3 large economies that will dominate the ASEAN because of huge domestic markets with tremendous human resources, still young and growing, and not to mention very rich natural resources. So here again, we belong to a very good group within the ASEAN. Next, please. This is just last year, a forecast made by a very prestigious think tank, the Oxford Economics Group. And take a look at what this group considered the 10 leading emerging markets that will dominate the global economy in the next decade. Number 1 is India, and we are number 2. Indonesia is number 3, and China is only number 4. Over a long-term horizon, China is going to increasingly face the tremendous problem of a demographic crisis. China is aging so fast that more and more people are joining the segment of people over 65, and there are not enough young people to take care of them. In fact, I know that there are Chinese organizations that are already preparing to teach Mandarin to Filipino nurses, teachers, IT workers, so they can start importing Filipino professionals. In the same way that Japan and other countries that are aging are doing the same thing even during the pandemic. Next, please. This is the most recent assessment of our strength. So this is The Economist saying that the Philippines is the 6th most stable emerging economy on the basis of 4 measures of financial strength. And I can definitely agree with this assessment because the Philippines has been able to arrive at both monetary and fiscal stability thanks to more than 10 years of fiscal discipline and monetary restraint. We have now built institutions, and it's very important for us to emphasize. It's not only the natural endowments that we have of population resources, we already have, despite our government still being rather incompetent, generally, politically, fortunately, in the area of economics, we have developed institutions that are very professional. The Central Bank of the Philippines is considered one of the best central banks among emerging markets, and our fiscal managers have kept our debt to GDP ratio, our fiscal deficit at very manageable levels, as was already mentioned by our chairman. For example, the 30 to 40% debt to GDP ratio stands out among emerging markets today. I'm sure many of you know that equivalent ratios in the United States is more than 100%. In Europe, there are a lot of countries with more than 100% of the GDP in debt. And that is why we can actually afford to borrow during this emergency. Our government can actually even bring our debt to GDP ratio to close to 70% without endangering fiscal stability, thanks to many years of fiscal discipline. And that is one reason why I think The Economist ranks us quite high in financial strength. Next, please. Then, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, that in the past used to be very critical of the Philippines, especially during the times of Marcos and post-Marcos. More than 10 years ago, taking a look at the global economy, they forecasted that in 2050, the Philippines will be the 16th largest economy in the world. Again, coming from an outside institution. Take a look at the countries that we're supposed to surpass, according to Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. Indonesia, Australia, Argentina, Egypt, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. Next, please. And most recently, the Japan Credit Rating Agency upgraded the Philippines from BBB+ to A-. Already referred to by our chairman. So all of these assessments, I repeat, come from outside independent institutions. And they must have reasons for considering us as very attractive over the long run. And let me just very quickly enumerate what I think they have considered in giving us all these complementary assessments. Next, please. First, I already mentioned our demographic dividend. Young, growing, and English-speaking population that will ensure that once we have addressed the pandemic and our 110 million population growing still at 1.6% every year will continue to be the main engine of growth because of consumption. Right now, obviously, this population is very wary about going to shops, eating restaurants, and so on and so forth. And that is why there's a very, very big drop in our GDP, because consumption comprises more than 70% of our GDP. But the moment we're able to address the pandemic, those 110 million Filipinos will be back consuming as if there were no tomorrow. First, in the sunrise industries that even now are already showing their attractiveness. And what are they? Food and agribusiness, the whole area of health and wellness, hospitals, clinics, pharmaceuticals, and everything that has to do with strengthening the immunity of people. Filipinos will now be very, very conscious about spending on things related to health. The third, sunrise industry, and we're seeing that computers, all type of smartphones and so on and so forth are being bought left and right for people to be able to join in the online learning that is happening in schools, meaning the products and services belonging to the so-called Industrial Revolution 4.0 will definitely be leading in the rebound. In fact, when we talk about a V-shaped recovery, we cannot talk about the whole economy. We have to talk about individual sectors. So V-shaped recovery will be food and agribusiness, health and wellness, the digital industry, and finally, everything that has to do with skills training, acquiring knowledge, not only formal education, but all the activities that improve, diversify skills of the working force. That will definitely be big business after the pandemic, in the so-called new normal. Then I already talked about our geographic dividend. We're right in the middle of the most dynamic region in the whole world, now called Indo-Pacific. And the temporal dividend is we are making a timely shift at the right period of our economic history. And what is that? We are graduating from low middle income status to middle income status or upper middle income status, and finally to high income in the next 20 years. This is what China went through over the last 20 years, going from lower middle income to upper middle income and closer to high income. We were about to become upper middle income in 2020, meaning reaching $4,000 per capita, but it did not happen because of the pandemic. But it's a matter of 3 to 5 years when we become a middle income society in general. And that means there will be a tremendous increase in the demand for discretionary spending on products other than basic goods and services. And that is usually the stage of development of a country that leads to a tremendous attractiveness of industries, when people will be spending not only on the basics, but on everything that a industrialized society spends on. I already referred to abundant natural resources, and especially for tourism. You probably read that a international tourism magazine, Tourism and Leisure, ranked Palawan as the best island resort in the world today. And Palawan has 2,000 islands. And there are many other areas in the Philippines like Palawan. So the moment we are able to attract once again foreign tourists, unfortunately that will take a little longer, probably it will take 3 years before we can begin to have foreign tourists. But our immediate recovery will be in the 60 to 70 million Filipinos who before the pandemic were discovering their own country, meaning domestic tourism. The moment the lockdowns are over and we can travel from one province to another, and we can travel from one island to another, 60 to 70 million of us will be the first tourists in our own country. And that means a lot of bed and breakfast facilities, restaurants, beach resorts will once again be attractive. I'm afraid that probably the more expensive hotels will take longer because they're the ones in which foreign tourists go to. Domestic tourists usually don't spend money on expensive hotels. They stay, and this is what my experience was when I lived for some years in Spain. Most of the tourists who go to Spain don't stay in expensive hotels. They stay in pensiones, paradores, all types of bed and breakfast facilities. Many of them converted convents, converted mansion, palaces, and that is tremendous for our SMEs. A bed and breakfast facility in Puerto Princesa or in Siquijor or in Dumaguete can be run by a family. Then the Build program started by President Duterte will surely be continued by at least the next two presidents. If you compare our infrastructures with our neighbors, starting with the best, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, we are so far from having the adequate infrastructure. So Build will be with us, and that will definitely be, after consumption, the second engine of growth in the next 10 years. And the final change I see, especially after the pandemic, because there is so much emphasis now telling people, get the hell out of this hell called Metro Manila and start going to the provinces, start going to the regions. And it is fortunate that over the last 5 years, many regions have been growing faster than the National Capital Region. They are Calabar Zone, their Central Luzon, even Bicol has been growing faster than NCR. Obviously, in the Visayas, Iloilo, for example, is my favorite place for expansion away from Manila. Cebu is hopeless, like Metro Manila. So those two are the ones that people should move away from. But Davao, very obviously, is a very attractive place for relocation. So this is another reason why investors should look at the Philippines, because it's not only the NCR, but regions outside of Manila. Next, please. Next, please. Well, let me talk about the negatives. Obviously, we will struggle to address these challenges. Low agricultural productivity. We have neglected the countryside for many decades. Probably one of the positive results of the pandemic is we have realized how important food security is. And hopefully, especially now led by a very good Secretary for Agriculture, William Dar, we will now make sure that we make up for all of those negligences in the past. And we invest more in farm-to-market roads, irrigation system, cold storages, the whole works of agribusiness. Then we still have, unfortunately, obstacles to doing business, especially for foreign direct investors, starting with our own constitution that is too restrictive. I have no illusions that we'll be able to change our constitution in the remaining 2 years of the direct administration. But I continue encouraging people to talk about removing those restrictions so that in the first 2 to 3 years of the next presidency, we'll finally be able to remove those restrictions that are discouraging foreigners from coming in. Paradoxically, we have a shortage of technical skills, especially in construction. And that is really more a sociological bias that parents and children have against anything that has to do with blue-collar work. We are addressing that. Many of us in education are trying to move the mentality away from the American model of everyone wanting to get a college diploma to the European model, where for a long time, most of the youth really went to technical schools. I have hopes that this will happen in the next 5 years. We still have very high rates of electricity. The good news is practically all big conglomerates are investing heavily in power plants. And the bad news for the people concerned about the planet is coal would be with us for a long, long time to come. If you take a look at the long-term plans of the Department of Energy, because our main concern is to bring down the rates of electricity, and coal is still one of the cheapest sources of electricity. Corruption and poor governance, that is something that we'll have to struggle to improve good governance for many years. My only consolation is a country like South Korea can become first world without having completely removed corruption. You remember they have sent to jail so many of their presidents. And for those of you, just to add a light note to this briefing, who are fond of crash landing on you, I'm sure you know that in that movie, you see corruption in both North Korea and South Korea. And finally, as was referred to already, there's nothing we can do about the natural calamities, the earthquakes, the volcano eruption, the typhoons. We just have to be prepared for it. So these are definitely the obstacles that people have to be aware of when they come here. But we are definitely ready to meet those challenges. Thank you very much, and I hope that I have answered some of your questions.